The letter they never opened is the story of Elena Rivers, a daughter quietly erased from her family's history, left out of the will, missing from photo albums, and even denied a seat at her father's funeral. The story begins with a silent shock and slowly unravels a web of buried memories, unopened letters, and a truth distorted by fear, resentment, and silence. Across 7 deeply emotional chapters, Elena doesn't just uncover proof that she was once loved, she chooses not to seek revenge through anger, but to heal through memory, connection, and voice. She doesn't reclaim her place through force or bitterness. She rebuilds her home, her identity, and her story with quiet strength and tender courage. In the end, Elena is no longer the forgotten one, but a woman remembered with gratitude, compassion, and a voice that touched thousands of hearts. Don't miss a single episode of our gripping family drama series. New stories are uploaded regularly, and trust us, you'll want to be the first to know what happens next. Subscribe now to HT Family Drama and become part of our growing community of viewers who believe that the strongest stories come from the heart of the family. Part 1. The Funeral Without a Seat. Elena Rivers stepped off the plane into the crisp autumn air of Colorado, her boots tapping softly against the tile of the nearly empty airport. The Rockies loomed in the distance, a jagged reminder of everything she was returning to, and everything that had pushed her away. She hadn't seen her father in 6 years. They had spoken occasionally in short phone calls that always ended before either of them could say what they truly meant. Still, she had loved him. She had loved him more than she could admit when he was alive, and now he was gone. Her half-sister, Celeste, had sent a text message, just one line. "Dad's gone. Service on Sunday." "No, I'm sorry. No, are you okay?" Just a blunt transmission, like a weather update. Elena hadn't responded. Now, with her suitcase dragging behind her, she felt every step between where she'd come from and where she had to go. She picked up a rental car, punched in the address to the family chapel where her father's service was being held, and drove in silence. The leaves along the mountain roads were brilliant with color, crimson, gold, rust. Colorado in the fall had always been her favorite, but today it all felt distant, as if behind glass. When she arrived, the small parking lot was already full. Black cars, polite conversations, the cold hush of morning that never quite reaches warmth. Elena walked up the steps in her navy coat, clutching the old envelope in her hand, an unsent letter to her father she had written years ago, never mailed. She didn't know why she'd brought it. Inside the chapel, the lights glowed low. Wooden pews stretched out before her. The first rows were filled. Her aunt, her cousins, former neighbors, and Celeste. Front and center in a tailored black dress, a pearl necklace Elena recognized from their mother's jewelry box. There was no seat left. Not one was reserved for her. She stood there in the entryway for a long moment, unsure whether to turn around or push forward. Someone behind her coughed. Another person offered her a polite smile, then looked away, not recognizing her. A strange flush of heat rose to Elena's face. She walked down the side aisle and stood against the back wall. She didn't look at Celeste. She didn't cry. The pastor began the eulogy. Words floated like smoke. A man of principle, generous spirit, a father to his children. Children. Elena wondered which ones they meant. The service ended. People murmured condolences. Celeste stood like a statue near the casket, receiving hugs, nods, whispered sympathies. Not once did she look toward Elena. Elena waited. She didn't want to cause a scene. She didn't want to be seen. When the chapel emptied, Elena stepped toward the casket. Her father's face, though peaceful, looked smaller than she remembered. She placed the envelope beside the flowers. "Goodbye, Dad," she whispered. She turned to leave. "Wait!" Celeste's voice rang out behind her. Elena turned slowly. "You shouldn't have come," Celeste said, her tone sharp. "I came to say goodbye," Elena replied, calm. "You gave that up a long time ago." Something in Elena broke, but it didn't shatter. It shifted. "I'm his daughter, too," she said. "Not in the obituary," Celeste snapped. "Not in the will." Elena stepped back. Then she left. Outside, the wind picked up. The sky began to darken. Elena sat in her car for nearly an hour before starting the engine. She drove not to the hotel but toward the old family home, and there, behind the maple trees past the mailbox that still bore the name Rivers, she saw it. The house. A window on the second floor still had the curtains her mother had sewn. The porch light flickered, and in the attic, behind a pane of dusty glass, she saw a single box, one last box, waiting for her. Please continue listening to Part 2. Part 2 is titled The Silence Between Sisters. Elena parked the car outside the house that once held her childhood and now held only dust. She hadn't called ahead. She didn't think Celeste would answer, let alone open the door. But she had to know if the house, her mother's room, the attic, and the family she once believed was hers, still remembered her at all. She walked up the porch steps. The door was unlocked. She stepped inside, and the familiar creak beneath her boots greeted her like a ghost. The living room still smelled faintly of lavender and lemon wood polish. Her fingers brushed against the armrest of the couch, where her father used to nap with his arm draped over the dog. Their old dog, Piper, dead 5 winters ago. "Celeste?" Elena called. Silence. She moved quietly through the house until she reached the staircase. It was as if the house had been paused mid-memory. Upstairs, her old room still had the pale blue wallpaper with fading sunflowers. A bookshelf remained, mostly empty save for an old diary she'd forgotten she owned. She opened it. The ink had smudged in places where she must have cried while writing. Down the hall, Celeste's room was pristine. Perfectly made bed, tight corners. On the dresser sat the same photograph from 2 decades ago. Their father, Celeste, and no one else. Elena had always been the one taking the photo, always outside the frame. She found the attic door unlocked, the ladder unfolded with a heavy creak. Dust flew into the air as she pulled herself up. There, in the corner, was the box, labeled Misk Rivers, 1989-1998. She opened it. Inside were birthday cards addressed to Elena in her mother's handwriting. Finger paintings from preschool, a ribbon from her 4th grade spelling bee, a lock of hair, her mother's journal, and a letter, yellowed, sealed. On the front, in careful looping handwriting, "For Elena, when she's ready." Elena held it to her chest. It was the first thing in years that felt like proof she hadn't imagined her mother's love. That evening, she sat in her father's study. The desk was still filled with pens that no longer worked and stacks of old receipts. On the wall, a frame displayed his degree in engineering. A shelf held neatly labeled folders. She pulled one out, her birth certificate. It had been amended twice, first to remove her mother's name, then to change her last name to Elena D. Reynolds. She blinked at it, confused. When had this happened? The door creaked. Celeste stood in the hallway. "You have no right to be here," she said. Elena turned calm. Did Dad change this? She held up the document. Celeste crossed her arms. He did what was best. For who? For all of us. You never belonged in this family. You were a mistake he tried to make right. A beat of silence. "That's not true," Elena said, voice steady. "I belonged to him. He loved me." Celeste's lip curled slightly. "He loved the idea of you." Elena stood. "You were never my mother. I never wanted to be." Later that night, Elena opened the letter. It was written in her mother's hand, dated 1 week before her death. "My sweet girl, if you're reading this, it means you've come home. I hope the years have been kind. I hope you found your voice. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you more. I was afraid they'd erase me and by extension, you, but you are mine. And you always were loved. Never believe the silence meant absence. I was always there. Love, Mom." Elena cried then. for the first time in years, not for what was taken, but for what was found. Please continue listening to Part 3. Part 3 is titled, The Last Box in the Attic. Elena didn't sleep that night. She lay curled on the couch downstairs, the sealed letter from her mother resting on her chest like an anchor tethering her to something lost but not yet gone. The house creaked around her in the wind. She listened to its rhythm, like breathing, as if the walls themselves remembered. Morning brought a pale light, washing the house in silence. Elena moved through the kitchen in slow steps, making coffee the way her father used to. 2 scoops of dark roast, no sugar, just a splash of cream. The scent filled the air like memory. She climbed the attic stairs again, this time not as an intruder but as a daughter. The box was still there, of course, but beside it something new, or rather something she had missed. A folded sheet of newspaper tucked beneath the insulation. She pulled it out carefully. It was an article from 1991. The headline read, Local Engineer Funds Memorial Scholarship for Wife. She read it aloud. After the sudden death of his wife, Catherine Rivers, local engineer Daniel Rivers has dedicated a scholarship in her name for young women pursuing science. He calls it a small way to keep her curiosity alive. Elena's breath caught. Her mother's name, on paper, in print, public. He hadn't erased her, at least not then. She kept digging. The second box was deeper in the attic, hidden beneath a tarp that smelled of old wood and mice. It was heavier than the first. Inside were tapes, VHS and cassettes, labeled in blue pen. Elena, 3rd birthday. Catherine, last days, audio. Her hands trembled. She gathered the tapes and carried them downstairs. The old cassette player in her father's study still worked. She clicked in the tape marked, Catherine Last Days. A woman's voice crackled to life, soft, deliberate, thin with pain but still holding warmth. If anyone's listening to this, Daniel, please tell Elena I love her. I know she'll grow up feeling like a question mark, but she is my exclamation point. The best thing I ever did. If they try to forget me, don't let them forget her, not her. Elena froze. She played it again, and again. The final time, she recorded it on her phone. Proof. Later, she drove to the town records office. I'd like to request a copy of my amended birth certificate and custody records from 1993, she told the clerk. The woman behind the desk looked bored. You'll need ID. Elena handed her driver's license. The clerk typed, paused, then frowned. You've been listed under 2 surnames. Did you know that? Elena nodded slowly. What else? There's a note here. Custody disputed, then reassigned to sole guardian. Celeste M. Reynolds. That's unusual. She wasn't your biological parent? No. She was my father's daughter from a previous marriage. The clerk raised her eyebrows. Then this will need to be looked into. Elena requested copies and left with a growing fire in her chest. Celeste had petitioned for custody after her mother's death. And won. Not because Elena was unwanted, but because she was young, and Celeste was convincing. The erasure hadn't been legal, it had been strategic. That night, Elena sat in the attic again. This time, she lit a candle. She opened her mother's journal. Most pages were about gardening, about what Catherine cooked for dinner, how many lavender stalks bloomed that spring. But near the back, a different tone emerged. Celeste doesn't want her around. I don't know what to do. I'm afraid Daniel listens to her more than me. She's so good at control, so good at making her absence of warmth feel like reason. I am afraid that if I go, Elena will be alone. Elena stared at the words. She wasn't imagining it. She hadn't been crazy. She had simply been silenced. She stayed in the house 3 more days, combing every drawer, every closet. She found letters her father had written to school principals, arguing that Elena had been unfairly placed in remedial classes. She found a certificate of excellence in creative writing with her name misspelled, crossed out and rewritten. She found one picture, one, of her, Catherine, and Daniel. A picnic. The camera had caught them mid-laugh. It was real. She framed it. She packed the boxes. She drove to a lawyer's office. It was time. Please continue listening to Part 4. Part 4 is titled, The Fire That Didn't Burn. The lawyer's office was in a quiet brick building, nestled between a florist and a used bookstore. Elena stepped inside with her box of papers, letters, and the cassette recorder in her tote. She didn't know exactly what she wanted yet. Justice, recognition, but she knew she wasn't leaving without a plan. Her lawyer, a warm, middle-aged woman named Karen Doyle, greeted her with calm eyes and a firm handshake. "Let's take this one piece at a time," Karen said. Over the next 2 hours, they pieced together the story. The amended birth certificate, the questionable custody transfer, the inheritance exclusions, and the audio message from Catherine. Karen leaned back in her chair. "You have something very rare in these cases. Documented proof that your legal identity and legacy were altered under suspect circumstances. You might be able to challenge the will." Elena gripped her cup of tea. But would that bring anything back? Karen looked at her gently. "It could give you something forward." That night, back in her hotel room, Elena unpacked the photos and letters she had saved. She laid them across the bed, sorting them into years. Then she did something she never thought she would. She called Celeste. It rang 5 times before going to voicemail. Elena left no message. She drove the next morning to the lavender field where her mother used to volunteer. It was fall now, and most of the bloom was gone, but the air still carried a faint trace of purple and soil. Elena knelt and dug a shallow hole near the roots of the oldest bush. She placed the unsent letter to her father inside. She whispered, "This isn't forgiveness, but it's not silence either," and covered it. The fire pit behind the house was where the family used to roast marshmallows. That evening, she lit it for the first time in years. In one hand, she held a stack of documents Celeste had used to rewrite her identity. In the other, the court copies and her mother's letter. She stared into the flame. She held the stack over it, but she didn't drop them. Instead, she turned and walked back inside. The fire crackled, waiting, but Elena had chosen to keep her history. 2 weeks later, the papers were filed. Karen submitted a petition to review the validity of the will and guardianship. A hearing was scheduled. Elena returned to Oregon and waited. She began to record, not for a court, but for herself. Into her phone's voice memo app, she read her mother's letters aloud. She told the story of the photograph. She shared her favorite memory of her father, one summer day when he taught her to skip rocks, a day before everything had shifted. Each recording became a chapter. She called the collection The Fire That Didn't Burn. At the hearing, Celeste arrived in a tailored navy suit, her hair pinned up tight. Elena wore the necklace her mother had left behind. Karen presented the documents, the audio recording, and the birth records. Celeste argued it was all a misunderstanding, that she had been trying to protect Elena, that Catherine had been unstable, that Daniel had made decisions in grief. The judge listened and then ruled the will would be amended, Elena's name reinstated, her share of the inheritance restored, the records corrected, no apology from Celeste, but something better, a beginning. Outside the courthouse, Elena stood under a cloudy sky. She didn't feel victorious. She felt real, and that was enough. Please continue listening to Part 5. Part 5 is titled The Court of Memory. Elena didn't return to the house again, not for a while. Something had shifted after the hearing, not just legally, but inside her. For the first time in years, she felt less like a shadow, less like an echo, more like a woman standing in her own name. Still, the questions didn't vanish. They hung in the quiet hours, in the gaps between thoughts. Who had she been before the silence? Who might she become after it? To find out, she did what she always feared to do. She reached out to those who had known her as a child, former neighbors, her mother's old friends, teachers whose names she remembered only in pieces. Each conversation began the same. "Hi, my name is Elena Rivers. I'm trying to put together a clearer picture of my childhood." And what she found wasn't always comforting. Some remembered her as shy, withdrawn. Some had no memory at all. But one, Mrs. Heller, her fourth-grade art teacher, said something that stayed with her. "You were quiet, but you watched everything. When you painted, you always used too much blue. I asked you why once, and you said, 'It feels like the only color that tells the truth.'" Elena smiled. She remembered that. She remembered being 8 and feeling like blue was the only honest thing in the world. She created a wall in her apartment, pinned with printed photos, Post-its, and string. Not like a crime board, but a memory map. In the center, a picture of her mother, laughing. Around it, notes from conversations, timelines, receipts, and quotes from the tapes. She labeled it, "The Court of Memory," because not every trial takes place in a building with a judge. Some are waged in the heart. She began publishing short audio essays online, each one 5 to 10 minutes. Titles like "The First Time I Disappeared," "Lavender and Ghosts," and "A Name is Not Just a Word." To her surprise, people listened. Then they responded, messages from strangers. "I thought I was the only one. I haven't spoken to my sister in 12 years. Maybe now I will. My birth mother died before I could meet her, but your words helped." Elena replied to every message, not because she had answers, but because she knew how much it meant to not be met with silence. Months passed. Winter softened into spring. One morning, a letter arrived. The return address was Celeste's. Elena stared at it a long time before opening it. Inside, a single photograph, her, Celeste, and Daniel. Elena was maybe 6, on a swing set, Celeste pushing her. On the back, written in careful script, "I don't remember this day, but clearly, at some point, I tried. I'm sorry I forgot. C." Elena sat at the kitchen table and cried, not from pain, from release. She pinned the photo to her memory wall, near the center, beside her mother's smile. Please continue listening to Part 6. Part 6 is titled, "The Room She Reclaimed." It was almost a year before Elena returned to the house. This time, she came not as a trespasser or orphan of the past, but as its rightful heir. She had keys now, deeds, and more importantly, clarity. The house was quiet, cold, still full of dust and shadows, but it didn't scare her anymore. She moved room by room, cleaning slowly, intentionally. Every corner she swept felt like uncovering a memory. She didn't avoid the hard places. The closet with her mother's sweaters, the spot in the hallway where she once overheard her father's harsh words, the kitchen where no one saved her a plate. This time, she stayed in what had once been Celeste's room. It was cleaner, neater, but also colder. She stood in front of the mirror where Celeste used to apply her lipstick with military precision. Elena wiped it clean and stared at her own reflection, no longer erased. She brought boxes of photographs from her apartment. She filled the shelves with both old and new memories, pictures from her healing podcast events, handwritten thank you notes from listeners, dried lavender bundles. The house began to shift, not physically, but in presence. It softened. It opened. She turned the smallest room into a studio, hung thick curtains, set up a recording mic, laid a rug with blues and purples and soft grays. She titled the room, "The Room with Her Name." And that's where she began her next project, a full-length voiceover memoir. She didn't name names, didn't attack. She simply told the truth. Each episode was a whisper of resilience, a declaration that stories don't belong to those who silence, but to those who survive. Listeners grew. So did the weight of her words. She was invited to speak on panels, at family therapy workshops, on podcasts for adult adoptees and survivors of erasure. But more than fame or following, she treasured the handwritten letters, older women, younger daughters, people in between, all saying the same thing: "You helped me find myself." One spring evening, she opened the window to let the air in. She heard children laughing down the street, and for the first time, it didn't hurt. She stood in her mother's garden. She planted lavender, And this time, she added a new sign. Not a headstone, not a plaque. Just a painted stone that read, "Elena Rivers grew here." Please continue listening to Part 7. Part 7 is titled, "The Name They Remembered." Years later, Elena stood behind a podium beneath a white tent in the same lavender field her mother once loved. It was no longer overgrown. She had worked with the community to restore it, planting new rows, dedicating spaces to memory, reflection, and peace. What had once been wild and forgotten was now cultivated and blooming. The sign read, "Catherine's Garden, a place for stories, left untold." Today they were unveiling a community archive, a listening room where people could hear Elena's full audio memoir and others like it. Stories of silence, rediscovery, and resilience. Elena adjusted the mic. She smiled at the small crowd, and she spoke. "For years, I didn't know who I was without the version of me others decided. I was edited, redacted, and in some cases erased. But the truth is, we are not who they forget. We are what we remember. This garden, this archive, these names, they are here because every voice matters. Even the quiet ones, especially the quiet ones." She stepped back. Thunderous applause followed. Among the audience were Celeste's daughter, now in college, who had recently reached out to Elena to learn the full story, and an older woman who had known her mother from the market, and listeners who'd driven hundreds of miles to attend. Elena walked the field after the event. Lavender brushed her fingertips. She saw a child reading the plaque beneath the listening room's door. In honor of Elena Rivers, the daughter who was once forgotten, and the woman the world now remembers. She didn't cry. She simply breathed in. It smelled like summer and peace, like stories rooted deep, and like a name that would never be lost again. Some people spend their whole lives just wanting to hear their name. Not on paper, but in love, in memory, in someone's voice that truly sees them. Elena was once forgotten, erased from the will, from the photos, from the story itself. But she refused to let silence define her. With quiet strength, she didn't just reclaim her name. She built a space where voices once ignored could finally be heard. She didn't need permission to exist. She claimed her place. With memory, with grace, and with love that needed no approval. And in that final moment when a child read aloud the plaque bearing her name, the world gave Elena what she had always deserved, a place in someone's heart. Thank you for your interest. Wishing you all the best. May God bless you.